Okay, so I'm going to start off. Welcome to this Social Research Association event. I'm joined today by Zoe Dibb from the Young Foundation, who's here to talk about peer research. So if that's the event you think you're at, good. I've just said to people who arrived early, you can see us in the presentation. You can't see the other participants. Don't worry about your screen setup if that is the case. The Social Research Association promotes excellence in social research. We're the membership organisation for social researchers across the UK and beyond. Do check out our website afterwards if you're not already a member. I'm Daniel Stunnell. I'm just here to chair today's event. I'm co-chair of the SRA Scotland Committee, and I'm also a UK SRA trustee. In my day job, I'm an environmental policy researcher with Eunomia Research and Consulting, so I'm really interested in today's content actually from a professional point of view as well. In terms of housekeeping, this event is being recorded. It will go on the SRA YouTube channel, but those of you in the audience aren't being recorded, so hopefully that doesn't cause you any concerns. The only thing that will be public is any questions that you submit. In terms of submitting the questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you can't see it, move the mouse around a bit and it should come up. We've got a Q&A period scheduled after Zoe's presentation, but please feel free to submit questions as we go along so that we've got some to choose from at the start of the Q&A if you wish. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's speaker. So this is Zoe Dibb from the Young Foundation. Zoe has extensive experience designing and delivering participatory research projects right around the world, and has a particular interest in raising standards and sharing learning on what works in peer research, which we're obviously just about to hear more about today. Earlier this year, Zoe chaired Hive, which was the UK's first conference dedicated to peer and participatory research. So rather than me trying to introduce the topic, I'm going to hand over to the actual expert in the room. So Zoe, please take us away.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm just going to share my slides, I hope. Can you see those? Okay, so yeah, as Daniel said, I'm talking today about peer research and sharing what works. I'm Zoe Dibb. As Daniel said, I'm the head of research at the Young Foundation, and we're the UK's home for community research and innovation with a long legacy of doing participatory research with communities, particularly those who are considered less heard. This year, we launched the Peer Research Network, which brings together people and organisations who are doing, funding or interested in peer research. We're now an accredited centre with NCFE, the Northern College of Further Education, offering a level 2 peer research accreditation through them. And we also deliver training and events, all with the aim of raising standards and improving the quality and legitimacy of peer research across the UK. So today I'll be giving you a brief explanation of what peer research is and why it's used. I'll then pose some questions to help you decide whether you should use peer research in your work and talk through some of the key learning I've realised from working with over 400 peer researchers in projects across Africa, Asia, North America and the UK. I'll talk for about 20 minutes and then we've got time for questions at the end. So as Daniel said, feel free to type those as we're going in the Q&A function and we'll come to those at the end of the session. So what is peer research? Put simply, a peer researcher is someone who's had a similar experience of something to the people they're researching. And this could be place-based. So I'm a peer researcher based in Barking and my respondent lives in Barking too. Or it can be based on a shared experience. I've used a mental health service and my respondent has used a mental health service too. And so I'm talking to them about that. And increasingly organisations want to speak to people about their lived experiences when they're designing and evaluating programmes, and they're increasingly believing that the best people to understand someone's experiences are other people like them. So a small note before I moved on, which is that what I call peer research, you might call co-production, you might call it citizen social science or community research. It doesn't really matter what you call it. I'm just interested in the Young Foundation, the Peer Research Network are interested in it being done well. So why use peer research? There are many advantages to adopting a peer research approach. Firstly, it can provide access to less heard voices. Because peer researchers identify with the community being studied, they often connect with people who might be unwilling to engage with professional researchers, and people who have never been involved in research before, or who haven't really kind of been asked to or had any interest in being involved in research. Peer research can empower participants. It's about conducting research with and for people affected by a particular experience. That changes traditional power structures and redresses the imbalance of outsiders conducting research. There are benefits to peer researchers themselves. So beyond being paid for their work, which they should be, peer research can provide valuable work experience and training that might increase peer researchers' employability in the future. And many peer researchers say they gain soft skills like communication skills, leadership, from participating both in training that relates to being a peer researcher and actually doing the research. There's obviously an added value that comes from a shared lived experiences. So peer researchers draw on their own lived experiences when they're talking to respondents, and they bring a lot of context and understanding of context into the analysis process that happens during peer research projects. The thing I'm really concerned with, kind of obsessed with, is the idea that peer research can gather better data. I think when those conducting research have experiences in common with the people they're talking to, it reduces the risk of misunderstanding, increases the likelihood that conversations will be relevant to the people involved. And in addition, quite often when peer research is done well, you find that respondents are much more candid. They're much more likely to talk honestly about their experiences with someone who they believe has shared that experience or who understands what they're talking about. Finally, when peer research is done well, it can activate communities. So peer research data that is shared back with the communities that it comes from has the capacity to lead to social action and social change. So how is peer research different from other types of research? So to recap, peer research is different because it should be neither extractive or tokenistic. It genuinely involves peer researchers in design and delivery of research. Skilled peer researchers build trust with their respondents based on those shared experiences. It aims to reveal authentic insights into people's lives and experiences. And ultimately, it's about research being done with and for people rather than to and about them. So if you're thinking about using peer research, and it seems like everyone is at the moment, when should you use it? We had a client recently who approached us and they wanted to recruit nearly 100 peer researchers or people to be peer researchers to speak to 500 respondents to inform a strategy in a 3-month timeline. Why not do a survey? I think a lot of funders now want to include lived experiences in their programs, and they're seeing peer research as a really good way to do that, but they're not necessarily allowing the budget, the time, the resource to let the people implementing peer research to do it well. So how do you decide whether peer research is the right approach for you? I would encourage you to ask these 2 questions. So 1, are you doing a peer research project because it's the best method to answer your research questions? Or is it just a method that everybody is talking about at the moment? And are you or someone else committed to act on any findings that are revealed by your research? I would say if you can't answer yes to these questions, then don't do peer research. You're wasting people's time, you're wasting resources. There's no point in doing peer research just because someone likes the idea of the method. And there's no point in doing peer research if you know that there's no plan for how the findings will be used. I would go so far to say as this should apply to all research, but there might be pushback on that. But if you've decided that you answer yes to both of these questions, then you can move into thinking about the design of your project. And when you're designing a peer research project, you'll need to decide how participatory your project will be. At what stages can you feasibly involve peer researchers and meaningfully involve peer researchers? It can be useful to ask yourself, how good will my data be if I do this? You need to decide what parts of the projects are set in stone. So maybe the funder has particular things that need to be kind of achieved, and what parts of the project could be left more open and more flexible, so peer researchers can be more involved in shaping it. So will peer researchers be able to inform the overall research objective? Quite often not. Quite often the research objective is set by someone who needs to answer that question. But we usually involve peer researchers in refining the research questions that will sit under that objective. You can involve peer researchers in deciding who your sample will be. And it would be prudent to involve them in recruitment because they're normally really good at reaching through their networks to find people who you might be able to not usually be able to include in your research. One really key question I would ask early on is, are you going to have peer researchers designing their own individual projects or using their own co-designed research tools? Or are you going to have one approach for the whole group of peer researchers that you're working with? Because that will have implications when you come to do analysis. Will you be able to tell one story across your data because you've had a coherent approach? Or will you have lots of disparate projects that don't necessarily add up to a whole that can answer your ultimate research objective? Will you involve peer researchers in analysis, the write-up and sharing findings? So these are sort of things you need to decide before you go into recruiting peer researchers, partly so you can set expectations about what their involvement will be. So if you've decided that peer research is the best method for your research objective and you have a way to utilize the findings revealed by peer research, I'm going to talk now about 5 key considerations that we've kind of come to, we ask ourselves and we refer to having done lots and lots of peer research at the Young Foundation. So these are really useful kind of points to consider as you're designing and delivering peer research projects. So the first is that peer research takes time to do well. Obvious. I mean, I don't want to teach you to suck eggs, but I think it's really important to recognize this. So one key consideration will be your timeline. A couple of months is not enough time to recruit and effectively train new peer researchers, to design research tools, to recruit respondents, to collect data, let alone have time to do good quality co-analysis. And the bedrock of any peer research project is a coherent and supportive team, and an understanding that failure is okay and there will be problems that come up, and a way to kind of talk about those and support each other through them. Doing the research bit of a peer research project is often the easy part. It's the bits around the research that peer researchers need time to practice and build confidence in. Things like explaining the project to someone in their community, approaching someone to ask them to be part of research, talking a respondent through an informed consent process, or explaining why they want to collect their demographic data or record their interview. Peer researchers need time to practice doing all of these things so that when they go out and do their real life research, they're really confident and comfortable doing that. We often ask peer researchers to test methods with friends and families as a way to practice, build confidence, and provide us with data we can provide constructive feedback on. So I would say if you don't have time to have a small pilot before you're doing your field work, which allows you to review the quality of data and give peer researchers one-to-one feedback, you should definitely be choosing another method or finding more time. Secondly, training is really key, but real learning usually happens after training. So all peer researchers need initial training to build core research skills, but in a workshop setting, whether that's online or whether it's in real life, everything is pretty conceptual. So practice always trumps theory, and real skills building starts when peer researchers are actually practicing doing research. So we found that building in refresher training after some practice fieldwork can really dramatically increase the quality of the data that the peer researchers are collecting. And it also provides a space for asking questions, problem solving and pivoting when things aren't going exactly to plan, as sometimes they do not. Alongside training, making space for discussion and reflection is really vital to ensure that peer researchers feel supported and everyone in a project is discussing how they're feeling about what they're doing. There's often lots of unexpected emotion, emotional labor that comes with doing peer research, and particularly doing research with people you identify with or in a place where you work and live. We utilize reflective logs and diaries and ask all peer researchers and actually anyone on a peer research project to keep them. And these can be kept in written format or sent as WhatsApp notes or recorded. But they're just a way for peer researchers to make space and time to reflect on their own practice and to ensure that that isn't being left behind with the focus on collecting data from respondents. I mean, again, if you've done research, you know that recruitment is hard. But I think at the Young Foundation, we've definitely learnt the hard way that recruitment always needs more time than fieldwork, no matter how much time we put into our timelines. That includes recruiting people to be peer researchers, as well as recruiting respondents to take part in research with peer researchers. And recruitment is often the thing that peer researchers themselves are most anxious about in the research process. So every single time I train peer researchers, I'm always asked, will I have to knock on people's doors and have to say, no, you won't have to do that, but you will have to approach people, sometimes cold, and explain to them what a research project is about and ask them to be part of it. So you do need to be prepared to do that, and it takes time to have the confidence to do that. I think when you're recruiting both respondents and peer researchers, it's worth really thinking through what their motivation would be to take part in a project like this. We used to sort of share recruitment posters with community partners when we were trying to recruit peer researchers, and we would really stress all of the skills that they would gain from being a researcher, learn about research, gain communication skills, leadership skills, and no one applied to be a peer researcher. Then we flipped it and said, get paid to talk to people in your community. And we found many more people found that kind of communication accessible, and people did want to be paid to talk to people in their community. That sounded quite easy and like something they could do. So we've really demystified the recruitment process and made it as open and accessible as we can. So we often allow peer researchers to text a response to a question to apply. We don't ask for CVs, but the important thing is that everyone who applies gets a short interview to actually talk through what the commitment will be, so that we know that there will be a good match, and they're able to make that commitment to a project. I think sometimes when you're working with members of a community, that becomes just as important to a commissioner in particular. In the project itself, it's more important that you're doing peer research than it is that you're collecting good quality data. But I think you should never be complacent about the quality of data peer researchers are collecting. The whole point for me of peer research, as well as activating communities and giving peer researchers new skills, is that peer research data should uncover new and interesting insight about people's lives. So I think repeatedly asking yourself, could we have gotten the same depth of insight if we'd used an open-ended survey or if we'd done a focus group? That helps remind you of the importance of digging deeper with your peer research methods to uncover those new and authentic insights. And also, when timelines are tight, opportunities for reflection and learning, they fall off the table. But I think if peer research is going to be good enough quality to be taken seriously, to make decisions off the back of, to inform policy and programs, then project teams need to continuously reflect on learning to drive up the quality of insights being revealed by peer researchers. Peer researchers add enormous value to analysis. And I would argue that if peer researchers aren't involved in analysis, it's not really peer research. You're just using peer data collectors. So involving peer researchers in analysis is a great way to identify collaboratively who needs to hear findings and how best to share them. And peer researchers bring an enormous amount of experience and context to a co-analysis process that your kind of professional office team won't necessarily have. Finally, the whole idea of peer research is that you're working with members of a community. And one of the main reasons for doing this is that this kind of research is less extractive than traditional methods. However, sharing back findings is still often the stage of a peer research project that gets the least attention, and it definitely gets less time and budget than the front end of a project timeline. Quite often, this just doesn't happen. So at the Young Foundation, we spend a lot of time thinking about research findings get back to the people they came from. How do we close that loop? And how do we make research findings useful to the communities they came from? Related to this, how do we know when peer research is an effective way of influencing decision-making? So this is a photo of a community validation event we did in Thamesmead a couple of years ago. We had done research with families in Thamesmead to understand what it's like to live in an area that's undergoing a massive amount of regeneration. So we used this session at a youth centre to ask anyone who had been involved in the research to come down and see what the interim findings were. This PowerPoint slide, it's not a great photo, but those pieces of paper on the wall are all of the thematic findings from the research. And then there are photographs there that we've chosen to represent the respondents in the research in their lives. So we asked families to come down and kind of discuss those findings and tell us whether they felt they had been accurately reflected in those findings that we were then going to present onto a client. We also asked respondents to tell us what they, on reflection, now they were out of the research, what parts of the research had they felt comfortable talking about, and what parts of it actually had they not been so honest about. And we assumed that mental health would be a topic that people had felt less comfortable discussing, but actually what they told us is that finances and how their household income was an area that they hadn't been completely honest and open. And so through identifying that through respondents, we were able to add that as a limitation to the report. We had also we'd done co-analysis and identified key themes within this research. And one of them was around healthy eating and family eating habits. And we had said from the research, we had seen that families tended to eat alone. So a mum might eat on her own when she got home from work, and a child might be fed when they got home from school, and teenagers were eating in their rooms on their own. But generally, our finding was that families did not eat together around a table. But through this validation event, we had a mum come down with her kids who pointed to this finding and said, hang on a minute, that doesn't represent me. I told you that every single night my family sit down at the dinner table and we eat together, and that's a rule in my house. And why have you said that is not true of me? So this validation event was a very good way of people ensuring that they were actually correctly represented and that we hadn't, mistold their story. And so in that instance, we were able to create a case study out of that family and kind of pop them out in the final report. But it's this kind of engagement with respondents and communities where research comes from that can strengthen your findings and make sure that they actually accurately reflect what people have told peer researchers. So to recap, there are 5 key learnings that I've just gone through. I mean, if you take away anything, try and remember these 5 things. So time, peer research takes time to do well. Training is key, but the real learning happens after. Recruitment's always hard, build in time to do it. Think of creative ways of doing that. Involve peer researchers in doing that for sure. Don't overlook the quality of your data and try and think about ways to close the loop. I think in peer research in particular, that's easier because often the peer researchers who you're working with they'll remain in the community that they've come from, where they've done their research. So there are opportunities there to work with peer researchers to make sure that they are sharing that data back and using that data in other ways to activate social change or social impact where it's come from. And so, like I said at the start, we launched a peer research network earlier this year. And the whole idea is that we want to share learning and best practice with other organizations who are doing peer research. The Young Foundation isn't doing the best peer research, but we just felt like there was a gap in sort of learning and evaluation of projects and a place for someone to bring organizations together. So that's why we've launched this network. We've got a regular newsletter, we're holding events and webinars. We have a number of open courses that I'll talk about in a minute. We're sharing job opportunities for peer researchers. So we're really keen that if people are trained as peer researchers, they don't just work on one project, but they have opportunities to continue in other projects with other organizations. And we have a roundtable series called Hive Minds. I think the next one is next month. But if you would like to attend, then please visit our website and sign up, and then we'll keep you informed that way. So 2 trainings that we have coming up. One is an introduction to peer research. There's one date in July and one in August, and there'll be trainings probably every month after that. And then a new training we have called Introduction to Participatory Research, which is happening in September. And I mentioned the NCFE peer research accreditation earlier, but if you are working for an organization that is working with peer researchers and you're interested in them being accredited, then drop me an email. And we can talk about that because we can accredit external peer researchers as well. And I think that is it from me. So thank you very much for listening. I think there are some questions in the chat which I can answer now, but feel free to keep dropping them in.
Thanks, Thanks, Zoe. That's brilliant. Thanks to everyone that has submitted a question. You still can do so. It looks like you can upvote questions that are in there as well if we end up with too many to get through. So do feel free to do that. I was just wondering what the best order into these might be. And I think I was actually going to start with the one at the top of the list. So what's the role that remains for the professional or the academic researcher in this, in the peer research world? And I think this question is very much coming from not a skepticism about peer research, but almost a skepticism about the role of the academic or professional. Well, how would you answer that?
I mean, firstly, I would be really interested to hear if anyone has a better, I always say sort of professional or academic researcher in inverted commas, and feel a real awkwardness about that. Quite often I just say like people in the office, the researchers in the office, to refer to myself. But yeah, I think there's some tension there around what researchers are called, and we naturally sort of elevate our own professional position against peer researchers. That feels quite uncomfortable. But I think the role for the office people is one of probably support and coordination. So I found that whilst the peer researchers I work with are doing the bulk of the research and doing that really, really well, there's still a role for bringing people together, for training, for ongoing support. I mean, obviously the dream is that eventually you're out of a job. And I've worked with peer researchers, actually adolescent girl peer researchers in Nigeria, on a project years ago, and now they have their own research outfit. So they've set up their own consultancy and they're doing research for other organizations. So I think, you know, I haven't seen that yet within the peer researchers who are working at the Young Foundation, but I think when you're thinking about the life cycle of a peer researcher, if someone wants to stay in research, then there should be potential for that. We've also employed peer researchers who now work with us in the Young Foundation as well.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. So yeah, I don't know if career researcher is the word that I'm kind of thinking of, but I'm not sure that's quite right either. Yeah, it's a tricky language one, actually. I think sort of a little bit linked to that, there's a couple of questions about how you're involving the peer researchers in the co-analysis, and you talked a little bit about this. But I mean, one of the questions here, for example, is what kind of training do you offer to peer researchers? How deep into methodology do you go? And again, they've put professional researchers in inverted commas here, but there's that expectation you've got a master's or a PhD or something. Like, what, are you teaching methodology? How are you actually getting them involved in the analysis stage?
In a very practical way. So we tend to break our training down into the training you need to do the research, and that's usually around 2 full days of core training and then practice sessions before peer researchers go out and do field work. And then we come together once we have data to do training and co-analysis, and that involves, we've done it in lots of different ways depending on the group and depending on the project, but it usually involves reviewing data either on your own and as a group. So you could be reviewing transcripts of your own interviews and transcripts of your peer researchers' interviews, and then starting to get into identifying themes. Usually we're doing thematic analysis. Sometimes we'll co-create a coding framework, which we then use to go off and code the data. In other projects, we've created a coding framework that the peer researchers use to go off and code data. We found Deduce really good, DEDOOSE. It's like in Vivo or MaxQDA, but it's all online. And it means that peer researchers can all collaborate on coding data. And recently I've been using Miro a lot. MIRO, I'm sure loads of people have used it, Miro or Jamboards, which allows peer researchers to kind of take notes on virtual post-its, and then together we'll have sessions where we kind of group and theme things. What I found generally is that peer researchers are less, the ones we work with, or the teams we work with, generally don't really want to get involved in the writing. Just like, come on. No one wants to do that bit. So we tend to do quite a lot of the writing, but then there's lots of like sense checking and feeding back within that writing process. And quite often peer researchers will be creating alternative outputs. So we've just worked with a group of youth peer researchers on a project understanding youth priorities to inform a strategy. And within that, each regional group of youth peer researchers has created their own creative outputs that have been integrated into the kind of longer form report that goes to the client.
Yeah. And so I guess I've got a question as well, just to abuse my position as chair. I mean, I think as researchers, we, you know, that image of the neutral researcher that's completely detached from the situation is very, very old fashioned now. But I thought it was interesting what you said about commissioners wanting peer research. There is clearly a bit of a blurred line between the research and the engagement here. And actually, do you find the push is coming from a commissioner that is not really wanting research? They're wanting to kind of tick an engagement box with the community. I guess I've got a question about how you deal with non-social researchers and their expectations about it. And before the session, I was thinking, well, maybe this is, can you sell it to them? But it actually sounds from your presentation like it's the opposite, that they want it even when it's not appropriate. How do you manage their expectations about that and kind of keep the research element in there and not sort of let it turn into a public relations exercise, I guess?
It's a good question. I think the way we've dealt with it recently is talk about evidence-informed social impact. So we've got a project at the moment which is working with youth peer researchers, and ultimately I think the funder is interested in the social change and the social impact that comes out of this peer research project. Personally, I'm interested in the peer research and the evidence that is generated by the project, but increasingly we kind of stress the need for social change to be informed by evidence, and peer research is a great way to collect that evidence. So I think if you can break down your project into those stages and ensure that the peer research bit comes before the social action and the social change and the community innovation bit, then it's a sensible sort of approach to not mixing those two things. I think the risk comes when those two things are meant to happen at the same time, or actually the social action bit is the thing that people are concerned with and they want that to happen first, and then the peer research is actually like an afterthought.
Yeah, okay, that's really helpful. We've got a question here which is very much at the practical end. Where to start when commissioning peer research? In our organisation, we often struggle to find research partners with skills in co-production. How do we find providers with these skills? Where do you start if you're sitting there going, peer research is what I want to do here, but we don't have the experience or the capacity?
Come to the Peer Research Network because we increasingly are a network of people who are doing peer research, and you can talk to me about doing peer research and I can either say, well, we'll help you with it, or recommend people who can help you. So yeah, please, a little plug to join the network, because that is the place increasingly where people are coming to share their experiences. And also we did a really, maybe I can get Monica to send it around afterwards. A couple of years ago, we did a big desk review that looked at peer research projects across the UK. It's very UK based. And we reviewed like 50 research projects. So if you read that report, I think there's an appendix in the back, which shows all of those projects and who was delivering them. So that will give you, it's not completely complete. Quite a lot of peer research projects aren't online, so we couldn't find them, but that will just give you a good sense of who's been doing some interesting peer research over the last 5 years.
Yeah, okay, thank you. We've got a couple of questions here that are more about ethics, I guess. One, which I just lost track of now in the queue, was, are there any further considerations, rules or differences when doing research with particular audiences or topics, thinking particularly about vulnerable groups? But there's a few others, like whether particular topics like sexual and reproductive health have caused issues. You're obviously taking people potentially in a community and involving them in the research. Are there additional ethical considerations that you need to think about?
Yeah, definitely. So we have developed a fairly standardized core training that all peer researchers who train with us go through. But if a research project is about a particularly sensitive topic, then we have bolt-on modules, or we'll design new modules that respond to that. So we have been working on a project with young people who are exploring experiences of youth violence. So we have developed a module that is all around talking about violence and some of the actual legal implications of someone disclosing to you that they have been part of a crime that they haven't yet been tried for instance. I think what I've found, and I've done research with peer researchers on lots of tricky topics and lots of sort of insecure environments, is that the professionals or the adults in the room often, because I've been working with young peer researchers, are very concerned about the peer researchers not being able to talk about this thing and all of the potential implications that could come from talking about sensitive subjects. And the people who are the peer researchers or who become the peer researchers don't have those same concerns, or their concerns are mitigated quite quickly once they understand that there are safeguarding processes in place, once they understand kind of ethics and consent. So I'd say don't let it, obviously you need to consider all these things, but don't let it be a barrier that stops you from considering peer research to explore a sensitive topic. So I think actually peer research can add the most value when it's used to discuss things that might feel kind of untouchable with other forms of research.
I thought your comment in the presentation actually on the mental health versus finances and the sensitivity around that was really interesting, because I think sometimes when we're doing our ethics papers, the things we think participants might be worried about are not necessarily the things they're going to be worried about as well. So I just thought that was really interesting observation. We've got a couple of questions here, I guess, coming back to this role of the career researcher or the professional researcher. One is to sort of say, actually, an experienced qualitative researcher should be able to create those kind of empathies and imagine themselves with that group. And also a very good observation here, which says, actually, ideally, you've got academics and researchers that have that lived experience as well. So how, I mean, I'm imagining the answer is, yeah, we can have something of everything. But I mean, how do you see, or maybe I'd reverse the question, how do we get lived experience into kind of professional and academic research projects more, rather than having to go out to find peer researchers in the community? Maybe it's a development question for our profession.
Yeah, for sure. And our profession is very white and very middle class, and actually very female. We did some research with the Social Research Association about diversity in the profession, I think last year. So I'd encourage you to find that paper on our website. But yeah, I think opening the door so that different people can enter the profession is really important. We've had, we use the government Kickstart scheme. It's not worked for everyone, but it's been quite successful for us to bring in young people for 6 months to become social researchers within the Young Foundation. And we've now employed, I think, 6 young people as junior researchers off the back of that scheme. So I think finding ways to have paid internships, and particularly ways, if you're working with peer researchers, are there ways that they could enter the workplace more formally with you after they've finished their role? Obviously, you can't take everyone in, it just wouldn't be possible. But organizations have turnover and want to hire junior staff. So I think considering peer researchers as prospective candidates for their role is really sensible.
Yeah, we've got a question here which is about sort of sampling and recruitment in peer research, and it kind of links to something that I wanted to ask as well, which is, does this work only for kind of relatively targeted research populations where it's easier to identify what the peer group is? Or how are you confident you're getting actual peers to do this work in the community and not kind of atypical people that may actually be skewing the findings?
It's a good question, and it's a big risk. And I do think that once peer researchers are confident in what they're doing, they they can speak to people who are not necessarily peers, but are near peers. So I've worked a lot with young female peer researchers. I can see someone here is from Tega, which is warms my heart. I used to work on a project called Tega with Girl Effect, and we trained adolescent girls to become peer researchers. And when we started out running those projects, we were very focused on the adolescent girls being able to talk to other adolescent girls and the value of that research coming from that peerness. But actually what we found over time is that as the adolescent girl peer researcher became more confident in her role, she was equally capable of talking to an adolescent boy or an adult or a teacher or a community leader. And we did research on the respondent side to understand what it was like talking to an adolescent girl peer researcher. And people usually said, you know, actually, I found it really unusual and quite disarming. And I found myself saying much more than I would say than I thought I was going to say, because the girl was so good at like probing and asking me questions, and she really listened and I felt respected. So I think there's definitely a blurry line between, I guess that's about like a peer researcher becoming a more professional researcher and their capability of who they can talk to and the value they add, extending beyond just being able to talk to people in their small community. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think it kind of comes back to this point about the diversity of the profession, actually, which is saying people from different backgrounds can engage in different ways, just with their peers, but generally. And yeah, I think it's just a difference, isn't there, between speaking to that white middle class researcher and somebody that isn't. Just changes the conversation. One question here, is it fair to say that peer research is mostly used for qualitative projects rather than quantitative?
Yes, and I think the added value of peer research is that it's about uncovering insight, and it's about the value of that qualitative data and discussion. I've worked on quite a few projects that are mixed methods, so peer researchers are collecting some survey data alongside open-ended questions that relate to the topic. But I think when peer researchers are just collecting quantitative data, that's probably when they're citizen scientists. I've heard people talk about citizen social scientists recently, and I think those are peer researchers. So there's lots of like differences of how people are describing things. But yeah, it tends to be, I think, that when peer researchers are doing quant, then they're citizen scientists.
Have you used kind of peer researchers in questionnaire design for more quantitative projects? I mean, we often do message testing and so on, but actually that's not normally a co-design process as conventionally delivered by a research agency. I could actually see quite a valuable moment in a quant project when actually you got some peer researchers to take some of the questions apart, actually, but I don't know if you've ever done that.
Yeah, so when I worked at Girl Effect, actually, with the girl peer researchers, they would test all of our surveys and then provide feedback on whether they thought they worked and whether the questioning worked. We were also translating, so it'd also be, you know, has this translated in a way that you can understand? So I think there's a lot of value in maybe not necessarily designing from scratch, but checking and validating and ensuring that tools are fit for purpose. On the qual side, then we always involve peer researchers in co-designing the qual and the questions that they're answering, or if they're doing creative methods, the creative methods.
Yeah, I once did a project which we did cognitive testing on the question design, and it was some of the best research money we ever spent, I think, just to get people to actually say that question makes no sense to my life. It was really, really useful. We've got a question here again, coming back sort of more to the specifics of the method. What do you do in terms of sharing full transcripts with the professional, and how may peer researchers choose to feedback their findings? So again, just about the mechanics of what format is the information in, who gets to see it, how does that work?
Depends on the project. So I've been working with a team of peer researchers in Barking recently, and they're talking to people who live in others, neighbours and people who live in Barking about their priorities for this place that is undergoing a lot of regeneration. And to do the analysis there, we created transcripts from interviews that the peer researchers had done, and then we shared the transcripts with the group and went through and kind of coded and identified themes with them. So we were all in a room together and we were reading through transcripts. They were reading through their own and other people's, and then we were facilitating discussions about what findings were coming out. In the past, actually that project is in a second phase. So we worked a couple of years ago doing the same thing for a baseline. And in that process, the peer researchers wanted to listen to the recordings. So we provided them with the recordings of the interviews, and they would meet as a group and listen through the recordings and then take notes. And then we came together to discuss those. And then in other projects, you know, we've shared transcripts through deduce and their coding and doing it in a more kind of formal way. So I think, yeah, a mixture of approaches based both on the interest level of the group and on the project itself.
And linked to that, there's a question here about sort of quality assuring the interview techniques and how you're doing that, obviously potentially with people that haven't got that experience. How do you manage that, conducting interviews with office people, checking transcripts, etc.? Are the suggestions here, but how does that work?
Excuse me. So that, yeah, that relates to one of my points, which is about like having time and thinking about data quality. Excuse me. But we always build in a practice or pilot project at the start of any real life research project. And in that period, peer researchers are talking, they're given a number of people they need to talk to, using the tool usually that we've co-designed with them that they'll be using in real life. And then we, on our end, listen to recorded interviews and give them one-to-one tailored feedback. And I think that one-to-one feedback is super important to get before they're going out and actually talking to real life respondents. I had a peer researcher recently who she had done 2 or 3 practice interviews and she just wasn't ready to do field work. She wasn't asking probes. She was kind of lacking confidence in the way she described the project. And so in that instance, I went and met with her in person and we did some practice and gave her more respondents to talk to before she did her real field work. So I think I would not, don't underestimate the sort of value and the power in having that time to really give individualized feedback and allow the peer researchers to practice all of the bits that come with doing the research, not just the tool, but explaining who they are, explaining the project, explaining consent, collecting demographic information. They need to be really confident in all those aspects of the project.
And I guess, again, just following on from that, there's one here. Can you talk about the relationship between the peer researchers and the office-based researchers? I know the positionality of peer research is important, but how does any difference between peer and professional researchers impact on that relationship? So in the example you just gave, you are in that kind of training, I guess, kind of mentor role. What are the relationships like? Do they work well or not?
Yeah, I mean, I've had most of the time they work well. I had one project that I came in too late where actually the failure in the project was that we hadn't established early enough in the project what everyone's roles was. And I think we hadn't stressed the responsibilities that the peer researchers were going to have in the project. So there was a real misunderstanding about what, I guess, like professional boundaries, to be honest. And peer researchers were getting kind of confused and they were getting like emotionally involved with respondents and each other. And the whole thing just sort of went into free fall. I think based off that quite bad experience, when we train peer researchers now, we have a whole section about, and actually even in our recruitment, you know, we spell out what the commitment is going to be. So how many days are you going to be expected to work? What parts of the research project are you going to be involved in? How long is training going to happen for? What will you be paid? How will you claim your invoices? So I think there's the expectation around the professional side of being a peer researcher, and it is a paid role when someone is working with us at Young Foundation, is set out really clearly. And that that kind of clears up a lot of that tension. And there is a hierarchy, you know, I have junior research officers working with me and I'm more experienced than them and I'm older than them and we learn from each other. But I think it's the same when you're working with peer researchers. Like I'm training peer researchers. It's a respectful and open, honest relationship. It's a supportive relationship. But ultimately, if something goes wrong, I'm going to take responsibility for it. So I think there's an understanding that I'm both supportive and I'm sometimes kind of cracking the whip to say, can you do this research on time? Can you send in your invoice? And that works, I think 9 times out of 10, absolutely fine.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Just to the attendee that said I've asked some of my own questions, this is true, and I've also combined some of the questions in the chat to get through them, but I do apologise if I've mangled anyone's questions in the process of doing that. At the, well, not at the bottom anymore, but could you talk a bit more about some of the creative methods that you've mentioned as the questioner?
Yeah, so I can talk about actually the project Embarking with 4 peer researchers there. So there was a first phase of that project where the peer researchers were talking to residents about what it's like to live in Barking and what things they want to see change over the next 15 years, so on quite a long-term basis. And we co-designed with peer researchers a number of creative approaches to engage members of that community. So one of the things they were doing, or we were doing, was Lego Serious Play workshops. So actually you can pay quite a lot of money to become an official Lego Serious Play facilitator, or you can just buy a load of Lego and become a Lego Serious Play facilitator on your own time, which I've done. So we held workshops where members of the community came down and they were asked by peer researchers to build their sort of vision for their neighbourhood in the future. And that allowed them to have discussions. It's kind of a jumping off point for discussions about the kinds of things and the kind of change they wanted to see locally. They also asked some respondents to keep photo diaries. So respondents were asked to keep photos of the places that they liked locally and the places where they went, or the places they felt safe or unsafe. They were given prompt questions. And then the peer researcher returned to kind of discuss the photos that had been collected. So I think with all of these creative methods, the method itself is always, it's really enjoyable to deploy the method, and it can engage someone with research you wouldn't normally engage with it. But the important part of the process is the conversation that happens off the back of the method. And it's really important that that is recorded. When we started that project Embarking, we were doing all sorts of methods and we weren't recording any of those conversations. And when we came to do analysis, our first sort of interim analysis, we just had a load of bits of paper with like notes written on them and stuff in people's heads. So we learned from that quite quickly and made sure that whenever we were using a creative method, there was a really clear plan for how the conversation would be recorded, so that when we came to analysis, we were using primary data rather than secondary memories of what had happened in those conversations.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I think the questions we've got left on the list are ones we've touched on, but I guess just to give you an opportunity to see if you'd like to add anything. So we've got one here again, giving the example of working with adolescents and adolescent girls and the value of that in terms of their position in their lives, but whether that misses kind of barriers and parents, community influencers, etc. mentioned here. Is there anything you'd sort of like to add on your kind of thinking about that?
I mean, I think in my experience of working with adolescent girls as researchers, they were able to talk to people in a wider kind of network. But, you know, I think this comes back to the question that I asked at the start, like, is peer research the right method? Maybe it's the right method for one part of your research project and you need to complement it with expert interviews or some other elements. So don't think that, you know, to do a good peer research project, it has to be pure peer research. It can be part of a wider research mix. Yeah.
And again, the question at the top of our stack at the moment, what challenges do you encounter during training and have you adapted your approach to address these challenges?
I mean, all sorts of challenges. I think I've done so much peer research training now that the training that I deliver with my team is sort of preempt some of those challenges. So I think a lot of it is just about having time and space to do loads and loads of practice. And being able to do role play and give people kind of time together to share their fears and their hopes for what they want to get out of the training. I think one thing that always comes up, and I touched on this in the presentation, is how worried peer researchers are about recruitment. and how worried they are about approaching people and talking to them, and particularly recording the conversation. Peer researchers always say, people will never let me record their conversation. And I always say back, like, well, peer researchers always say that, but they always manage to do it. So just like giving that reassurance and allowing people to kind of practice and fail so that they do feel really comfortable and confident with all that stuff when they're doing field research.
Thanks. Okay, so very quickly, we'll try and squeeze in the last question we've got on the list. I've noticed the people asking for the links, and we will look into that after the presentation and see if we can email it to the attendee list. But yeah, the final question we've got, have you ever guided a team of peer researchers to develop their own individualized research guides to use? What are the benefits and drawbacks if you have done so?
Yes, I have. And I have found quite a few drawbacks when we've come to do analysis. I think, you know, it's obviously very empowering, and it's probably truer to like a pure peer research approach if peer researchers are allowed to design their own guide. But if you've got 100 peer researchers and they're designing 100 guides, then when you come to do analysis, ultimately you're doing analysis of 100 projects, and it's quite hard to then pull together a coherent story about a project. So I would, having learnt from experience, I think I would encourage projects or people running projects to have a shared research objective, shared research questions, and maybe some flexibility in the kind of questions that are asked in an interview or a group, but a real eye on, okay, if we allow peer researchers to design completely on their own, what's going to happen when we come to do analysis, because it will have an impact.
Thank you very much. We are right at the end of our window. Well, technically we're over our window. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending and for asking your questions. And obviously to thank Zoe for coming and talking to us about peer research in the first place. I thought that was really insightful. And thank you for being quizzed at the end of your presentation as well, so extensively. So yeah, thanks very much indeed to everyone. And if you want anything extra, you can obviously visit the Young Foundation website and also the Social Research Association website if you're interested in us and what we have to offer as well. So thank you all round, I think.
Thank you. And thanks, Daniel, for your excellent facilitation.
Fingers crossed. All right. Cheers, everyone. Thanks very much.
Bye.